Thanks everybody for joining on the Eight Figure Product Show. Today, have an awesome interview with Lance Cottrell. And before we get there, uh, this podcast we're going to focus on strategies to scale, lead, and exit your business. Uh, Hosted by me, Luke Peters, who I built and sold an $80 million brand. And so, yeah, we're going to talk about all the tactics, the strategies, things that actually resonate with the founder, CEOs. That's who we're after here. So if you want to learn more, head over to apexceo.co. You can sort of learn a little bit more about what I'm working on. And Lance, go ahead and give us a quick introduction here.
Thanks so much, Luke. Yeah, my name's Lance Cottrell. I am a lapsed astrophysicist. I founded the world's first internet privacy company and took that to a successful exit. Now I'm an active angel investor, private president of the North Bay Angels, and spend a lot of my time advising and working with early stage startups.
And Lance, I found the astrophysicist part really interesting. So remind me, you were working on your PhD, and I think you left before you finished to start Anonymizer. Is that how you got going?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I had this idea that I was going to launch a new startup as a solo founder and finish a PhD in astrophysics in my spare time.
Right.
So, probably not one of my more brilliant ideas, but yeah, I was working on the physics stuff. But being an astronomer at that time, and this was the mid '90s, I was directly connected to the backbone of the internet before most people knew the internet existed. I was
Oh yeah.
building websites for my astronomy group in 1993, and I think the World Wide Web was invented in '91 or '92.
Oh wow, that is early on. I'm trying to think back when I was like building my first, Pentium 100, I think it was, or way back when. That might have been maybe 98 or something like that, or maybe 97. So, and that felt like the beginning to me. So yeah, you were years before it became mainstream, I guess.
Yeah, it was you were building websites in a VI text editor on your Unix workstation, running CERN Server 1.0 to serve your web pages. I mean, it was brutally early.
Uh-huh. And back then, so tell us about the genesis of Anonymizer, because back then was internet security and being an anonymous, was that already a big like people understood like everything could be seen about you?
Well, not in the mainstream, but I
Mm-hmm.
think there were certainly people who were aware of it. I became aware of it. I started getting interested in security because astronomers sit on a mountaintop all night. And so they've got a lot of time to sort of poke around and see if they can work out what the other astronomers have been looking at on the previous or upcoming observing nights. And so trying to lock down your stuff against these curious, smart people was important. But this was
Mm.
also an interesting time when, and this is kind of the reason I got into this, was the government began to realize that privacy and security was important. And they said, what we need to do is we need to have the NSA design a cryptography chip that can go in every computer, make sure that it's universally accessible to have access to strong security, and we're going to keep a copy of all the keys. And it was the last part of that statement that bothered a lot of people, including
Yeah.
me. And so I got involved with a sort of underground crypto anarchist group called the Cypherpunks, building internet privacy and anonymity software as fast as we could, because we figured, as soon as they give everyone this chip with a back door, the next step is to outlaw actually strong cryptography. And we wanted to make a fait accompli. So that was taking off and actually being much more interesting than my thesis, because it turned out the Hubble Space Telescope was not big enough to actually answer my research problem. But I was, there were tens of thousands of people using my open source software and hundreds of people running the servers, and it was getting written up in the New York Times. And so I said, I really want to start a business around privacy. Clearly, there is a population of people who are interested in this, but most of the people who actually need privacy can't build the kind of things we were building. The first instruction was to go unpack this tar file and compile the software on your Unix command line. Kind of eliminated my mother and most other kinds of people from being customers. So
Mm-hmm.
I decided to start a commercial business that could really make it user friendly and accessible to the world.
So what was that spark? Was it just, was it literally doing your research and seeing this gap in the market and understanding, that was going to be an principle or an important concept later on, or what was that big spark
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. That I could see the amount of information that just I had available to me building these websites for my astronomy group, right? So I understood how much information was going to be leaked and realized this was going to really transform the whole idea of privacy. And I had great faith that the internet was going to transform the world in substantial ways. But at the time, of course, it really hadn't yet. This was very, very early. But I
Hmm.
was passionate about being able to bring this into existence and make it generally available. I was convinced that this was going to be a big thing. And then there was the moment, and of course, there was the politics around this and
Hmm.
understanding that the government was trying to build this thing, which got me involved in actually building these tools in the open source community. And then there was one day that told me I had to start the business. And it was funny. I was driving back from the university to my apartment, and there was a roadside billboard that it was always advertising the local shopping mall. And it would be, Macy's white sale or, whatever kind of random thing that they were advertising that week.
Hmm.
And this one day, it just said University Town Center, http www.utc.com. And I knew what a URL was, but I had never seen one in the wild, right?
Oh, well,
First
that's
time
funny.
I'd ever seen a URL, like on a billboard, especially.
Yeah.
And it was just this wake up call that said, the inflection point is happening now, and this is when I need to jump. And so I
Mhm.
immediately started to work on forming the business.
Okay, great. Now let's fast forward a couple years. What can you share? How big did you scale the company? People, revenue? It was a SaaS. I know you made it was a direct consumer, and then you made a pivot as well. That's pretty interesting. So you can
Yeah,
take us
it
through
was
that.
it was a huge pivot. So we started off doing direct consumer internet privacy. So,
Hmm.
you know, everyone knows how, these VPN providers nowadays, we were the first by a lot. But so we were providing the ability to go to websites and hide your IP address and delete cookies and just basically allow you to use the internet in a private way. And by the time the .com collapse started to happen, we'd ramped that up to about 1 million active users on the service, about 100,000 paying subscribers, getting our premium capabilities there. But we kind of hit a problem crossing the chasm from there, that all of the early adopters that we could find were already on the platform, and most other people were sort of really not aware enough of the internet to be concerned, or, as sort of I learned, most people say they want privacy and will sell out every piece of information about them for a 10% discount.
Yeah, true, true. Yeah.
And so we went through a really, really dark period during the .com collapse, right? That was
Mm.
brutal. There was no money coming in. It was holding on by your fingernails kind of situation. And then as things started to recover, we realized there was an opportunity in the government. And it's a great story. We realized there was an opportunity selling to the government while we were being subpoenaed by the local FBI cybercrime department. And that led us to pivot the business and eventually settle in on what was the really successful route, which is using the same underlying ideas and technologies, but building platforms for conducting online undercover operations for the intelligence community as a service.
Yeah. So totally different business model. Now, before we get into that, so how did you just bootstrap this? Did you take any funding, or how did you sort of get through that .com bust period?
So we raised about 2.5 million total over
Okay.
the entire life of the company. So it was sort of angel strapped, I think people like to call it,
Hmm.
right? A little
Hmm.
bit of angel money, but largely just funding it out of the revenue from the early customers. 2000 was crazy. I mean, rolling into the summer of 2000, we had one angel who was going to give us $1 million check just by himself. And McAfee.com, which was a subsidiary of the McAfee antivirus company, was offering to buy us for $12 million.
Mm.
And given that we were penniless at the time and had like 3 weeks of working capital in the bank, we thought that looked pretty attractive. And so we're like, okay, one of these is going to go.
Hmm.
And of course, as the .com collapse happened, the angel walked away. And the acquisition failed because the subsidiary's stock price went from 30 to 3 during the negotiations.
Oof.
And so, it was an all stock deal. The amount of ownership that we were going to be getting just was exploding. And so that fell apart too. And our only
Mm.
option then was to bootstrap our way out of it. And so we cut corners and reduced staff and, you know, got really, really aggressive on instantaneous return on investment, making sure that we could turn everything around. You know, no dollar spent that didn't have a return in under 30 days until the momentum finally started to come back. Things started to wake up again. And then we saw this opportunity in the government. And within 2 years, it was 80, 90% of our revenue. It just exploded.
Wow. So during that transition, so the was most of the revenue, 10 or 20 or $30 a month type of subscription, and then it changed with the business, right? It was a totally different subscription or payment model. Because I know you
Exactly.
went very deep. This is not just some, here, everybody in the government use a link. I mean, this was a this was a very customized service that you were providing. It sounds like.
It certainly got that way pretty quickly. So yeah, the
Mm.
consumer service, I think we tried to make it annual, and it was $70 a year
Okay.
for the consumer service.
Mm.
In the government, we started off just discovering what we could charge for it. But after a couple of years, by the time we were getting close to exit, I think
Mhm.
we were averaging something like $250,000 per seat per year.
Unbelievable. Wow. So
And
it was just
things had
so it
evolved
just
a lot. We
yeah.
were we were setting up the whole thing. We're moving funds around. We're setting up front companies because the opponents weren't some hacker in their mom's basement. This stuff needed to stand up to Chinese, Russian, and Iranian national counterintelligence efforts. And our
Mhm.
hand couldn't be seen, the US hand could not be seen in any of the things we were building. And so that
Mhm.
led to a huge amount of work, most of which was, in fact, not even all that technical. It was how do you hide all the traces and make sure that no one can track these things
Mhm.
back, even if they can subpoena the ISP or hack their servers.
Yeah, no, let's back up because it's, listeners might miss that part. So with the consumer, it's sort of like a VPN. Is that how the tracks are being hidden?
Eventually, it turned into being a VPN. I mean, when we
Mm.
started, VPNs weren't even the thing. But
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we've got some plugins that remove cookies and manage
Mhm.
identity, and we're hiding your IP address and making it
Mhm.
look some generic identity.
Mhm. And with the government, it was almost like you're having to make a whole front story, maybe entity structure and all these other things that are maybe even not, some of them not even technical in a sense, right? They're more
Absolutely.
strategic. Yeah.
Because, right, at the end of the day, if you're trying to hide who you are, generally it's okay that you look like you're being anonymous, as long as they can't work out who you are. But with our customers, most of the time, being seen to be trying to be anonymous would destroy what they were trying to do. They need to
Mm.
look like some random dude in Kandahar or,
Mhm.
you know, whatever location of interest they were going after. And that then requires having hair on it. Like, we couldn't just strip out all the cookies. You needed to have the cookies on your computer consistent with the identity you were portraying. Down to if someone tried to infect you with malware, you'd better get infected with malware because why is your, computer locked down to
Oh
NSA
yeah.
security standards? It doesn't make sense. And that can't then actually compromise your real computer and network. So you
Mhm.
ended up going down a very, very deep rabbit hole, which is why it was so much fun.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, I'm sure it's always stressful when you're running a business, but it must have been because you're a curious guy, right? And you're a scientist, so it must have been like also at the same time way more fun and more challenging, right? Because you're having to think, you're sort of having to think like third level, whereas most people just think, okay, if this happens, that happens, but then you got to go a whole nother step when you're sort of creating this story.
Exactly, right. We're thinking about, what
Uh-huh.
what are the ways in which someone could try to unravel this and how many different kinds of passive approach can we take? And fortunately, by the time we were really getting deep into the government space, we were hockey sticking and, it's still a lot of work, but it was nowhere near the sort of continuous existential dread that it often is when you're trying to find that product market fit.
Hmm. Okay, so and then we'll get to the story of you selling, but how about a couple of business nuggets? What did you learn? Like you had to go through the dot-com bust. Well, first of all, you're a scientist and you started a business, so I'm sure there's some things you had to learn there, right? I don't know.
I
You
had,
could, well, all of it. Like, what was your weakness? Did
yeah, I
you didn't
mean,
want to do the bookkeeping, or what part of it was the part that wasn't fun?
the biggest, I mean, yeah, bookkeeping's no fun, but I learned how to do that. The
Yeah.
biggest weakness was that I had really never worked in a conventional business in my life. So
Mm,
the whole management process and hiring people and trying to build a team and manage them was terra incognita. I spent a lot of
mm-hmm,
time approaching it like an academic, doing a lot of research and study to understand how to do this because my resume is high school job, undergraduate, lab tech, graduate school, TA, CEO. Right? That's the whole
mm-hmm.
resume.
Yeah. Yeah. So what worked for you then? As far so management was the hard part, but you had to build the team. So what was your way to make it work?
So, reading books, listening to podcasts, studying things, really trying to systematize it and find
Hmm.
sources that really talked about it in a practical way that would say, here's how to have a difficult conversation. Here's how to give feedback. Here's how to do one on ones. Here's the words to use. Because,
Hmm.
I was a nerdy ass scientist with, very, very strong introvert tendencies. So having those kinds of tools was critical. And I think you need to be realistic about where are your strengths, but more important, where are your weaknesses and how are you going to counteract them? What active things are you going to do to overcome those issues so that you can be effective? And that could be hiring someone to backfill that, like accounting. Find someone who
Hmm.
loves that and put them in that job. Or there are some things you just can't delegate. And so you need to make a real pointed study of getting better at it. Bring in a coach if you can.
Absolutely. I mean, did you just have a general team where you had, 4 or 5 direct reports, or did you find, since your style was a little different, that you hired almost like a COO or just one person to sort of run things so you could work on the parts you were passionate about? Did you go one way or the other?
So actually, that's really interesting. I ran it sort of in a conventional way for the first 5 years of the business, and as we were
Uh,
starting to roll into the end of '99 into the beginning of 2000, I had a board of directors at this point. I had a number of investors, and at some point they actually came to me and said, I think we're now scaling to the point where someone who actually has some background in business would be useful in the company. And I suggest that you should probably hire a CEO and then
mhm.
take the chairman and CTO, chief scientist kind of roles for yourself. And a few seconds of introspection said that yeah, they were absolutely right about that. The key to that experience, though, was I didn't let them do it. I took the reins. I did the outreach. I found a bunch of candidates. I interviewed them. I spent some time test driving them, and they test drove me, and ended up hiring a guy that was phenomenal. I mean, we were an absolute glued at the hip team for the next years up until we exited in 2008.
Yeah, what's really interesting about that is, and I'm sure you know this and remember this, but there was a big change where, remember back in the 90s, and I think this did start, or it was always that, the entrepreneur would get the company up to a level and professional business then had to come in, right? And a lot of times that backfired, even look at Steve Jobs, right? And then sort of that
Mm-hmm.
biography. But what you describe is different. But then fast forward into the 2000s, look at all these young entrepreneurs, and they stayed with the business the whole time because they have the vision, right? The Zuckerbergs, Bezos, and everybody else. So in your description is totally different because you found somebody. You probably, because you're a technical guy, sometimes these CEOs, these hired guns, they don't have any, maybe they don't have the technical chops or they don't have like the vision of the company. And you probably were able to, since you made the hire, you were probably able to keep that momentum going.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we were able to. I mean, we probably did a 3 month mutual test drive before we formally hired him.
Mm,
So we had a long time to sort of understand mutual strengths, weaknesses, working relationship, and build up that respect so
hmm.
that we could have confidence in giving other people the authority in their lane. And that ended up working really well because the guy I hired was yeah not technical at all,
Hmm.
but he had Wharton MBA and he'd been CEO of a
Mm,
division of a major international company,
hmm.
but understood that I had the vision, I had the understanding of how to make this work. But it is funny that business people are often bad choices because they want to do things the way they've been doing them. I remember a couple of years into our working together as we were coming out of the dot com collapse period, he looked at me and just said, most of the stuff we're doing here, they never taught us in business school, right?
That's
The
funny.
whole game is just so radically different at
Yeah.
that early stage, scrappy spot.
Uh-huh.
And you'll hire in even sometimes a CTO who's come out of a big business, and he expects to have processes and teams and resources and infrastructure that aren't going to happen. There's no money for them, and you can't afford to pay for things that are that indirectly valuable to the company at that stage.
And especially at that time, because I think now, well, I'm not, I haven't been to college in a while, but I think I would trust maybe more the college business class. There's a lot of entrepreneurial classes and adjunct professors now, but at that time it was such a change, right? A huge shift from, to this online world that was totally new. And so, yeah, I think, people who just came out of business school, it was, running a business and how you were probably doing it, a tech business was definitely something they didn't learn in school. Um, it's an interesting period.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you have to do things that would be, frankly, would get you fired in a big company. There'll be
Hmm.
times when you're in a cash crunch, like in 2000. We found ourselves in this situation where we had almost no working capital in the bank and mountains of debt. And we had this really scrappy fractional CFO who we were working with, and you know the approaches that he took were enlightening.
Mm.
One of our board members looked at us and said, "This guy you owe a lot of money to. Can he turn off the lights?" We're like, "Not immediately." He said, "He can pound sand." We're like, oh yeah, right. He can. You
That's true.
you can play that way because you have to play that way, right?
Yeah.
You have to survive. And the answer is, look, I can't pay you now. That's never going to happen. But if you sit tight, I am happy to make sure that we make you whole at the end of the day, assuming we're still alive.
Exactly. Assuming, and it's sadly a lot of companies are in that position right now. By the way, okay, the new tariffs just got my phone's blowing up, so it's going to be challenging times for a lot of folks right now.
I mean,
Same
it comes
situation.
around
Yeah.
on a regular basis where you
Yeah.
suddenly hit these things. 2008, everything falls apart.
That's
We
right.
we seem to see these patterns,
Yep.
and how you handle them and reacting early, I think, is one of the big keys. A lot of people wait far too long to start taking countermeasures to stay alive. Whereas, as soon as you start to see that runway coming to an end, you don't already have leads on the money. Taking radical, painful action at that point, I think, is the key to surviving.
So, yeah, it's so true. And I remember that during COVID as well. Yeah, you had to act really quick, and right now, and you also have to make sure you're sort of going with the momentum, right? Like you're going with the direction of the river. You're not going against it. So, and like in my company, 2008 we never even felt it. We just kept growing. We're an online business and everybody else was hurting. And so things change. It depends what season, you're in here, but yeah, don't fight don't fight the direction that things are going because these are way bigger forces than most of our companies. So um, yeah, that's interesting. So okay, so let's move on to let me ask you, what was your proudest or highest moment at the company? Was it the sale or was it maybe something else?
I mean, certainly selling the company was the absolutely biggest relief.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I think one of the proudest moments was when we got a contract with the Voice of America to build censorship circumvention tools to allow people in China and Iran to bypass those
Oh,
countries'
that's cool.
censorship regimes. And it was funny. So the guy I'd hired, Bill, as CEO, he'd seen an article saying that the Voice of America was signing a contract with some company to build this tool, and he finds the guy who's the head of this program, calls him up and said, "Don't work with them. We've got a much better solution." And it turns out they jumped the gun on it. And in fact, the ink was not dry on the contract. They were kind of unhappy the company had announced it. And so they said, "Yeah, absolutely. Send us this solution that you've created." I remember Bill walked down the hallway and goes, "Lance, we have this opportunity to do this thing with the Voice of America. I told them we have a better solution. Come up with one."
Oh, that's a great story.
And so we, spent the next 48 hours architecting a completely novel system that we then pitched to them, and yeah, scooped that contract right from under these other guys. And that was a lot of fun. And being able to get in there, and I mean, these were important things we were working on. I remember one customer, I was talking to them and said, like, what's driving this? Why are you trying to buy this, in this case, covert communications capability from us? And he said, well, we had this group of people who were helping us in this hot sandy country, and one of them turned out to be kind of unreliable and working for the bad guys. He told them, they leaned on the local cyber cafe. The cyber cafe then bugged all the communications, and all the rest of our people ended up headless in a ditch, and we don't want that to happen again. And
Mm.
you're like, oh, that's a
Yeah.
pain point,
You're like,
right?
this is an important project I'm working on.
That's right. You go back to your engineers and go, you know how we always say this is a life or death thing? I mean, we mean this literally this time. This has to
Wow.
work.
Wow. Yeah, that's a story. That's a story that you'll have forever. That's amazing. And did you ever, I'm just curious, like after you built it, did you ever get a like notice or see any of the fun communications that came out of it? I mean, these are countries that are locked down, and then all of a sudden you're seeing, wow, there's some cool reporting because we made this available. I don't know, anything's. I think the other option would be like a ham radio or something back then, right?
Yeah, it
So,
was pretty low tech. So, generally we would never get information about the details. We'd hear from a customer that
uh,
we'd enabled this thing or it had achieved this goal or, saved some lives or, allowed some operation to be successful. But it would tend to be sort of abstract. I mean, even just talking to us about the requirements required the highest level security clearances. Uh,
wow.
and so it was kind of funny. I would go into a meeting, they'd talk to me directly about what they're trying to achieve, and then I have to go back out to my team and describe what we're doing in a way that doesn't say anything classified, but still will get the thing built in a way that will achieve the mission objectives.
Yeah. Wow, that's exciting. So what year was that? And then what year did you sell? So kind of walk us through the sale.
So we started working with the government like I said, in 2001, shortly after
Mhm.
9/11 was when we did that big pivot.
Yeah.
Within a couple of years, we were starting to get into the big three-letter agencies and building things out there. So that would have been probably five, six. We were all in on those kind of high-end capabilities. I moved out to DC in 2007 because I started the company in San Diego, and at this point, I was living on an airplane because you can't have phone calls with these customers.
Oh, wow.
And so
Yeah.
it was just perpetual. So we moved out there in
Mhm.
2007 and ended up selling the company to a intelligence community focused systems integrator, very strategic sale in 2008. It was actually the second time we'd taken the company out. We'd taken it out previously in 2006, done the roadshow, talked to potential acquirers, and just weren't happy with the kinds of valuations that we got. And so we said, you know
Mm.
what? We're in a good place. We're going to just take this off the market, prove out another 2 years of a hockey stick, and we'll talk to you again. And that worked out really well. We'd shown another like doubling in the revenues, and we were in a fantastic situation. When we were exiting, we had 10 million cash in the bank and zero debt. So
Wow.
selling was a strategic choice, not an imperative.
Yeah, that's the best position to be in. You know, when you can say no to the deal, then your deals are usually a lot better.
If you
So
can't say no, you're not really negotiating.
that's true. That's another way to look at it. You're hoping, you're praying. Yeah.
That's right. Right. And they
Yeah.
say hope is not a strategy.
Yeah. So now what else, what I thought was interesting from our earlier conversation is you stayed on for a long time, right? It was another 10, 12 years, something like that.
Yeah, it's another 12 years. I had no
Mhm.
intention of doing that. So when I sold, I
Mhm.
had the usual 2-year handcuffs on. Uh,
Mhm.
but unlike most of the stories you hear, these people were actually really easy to work with. It was a
Mhm.
relatively small company. They really reoriented the entire company around doing what I did. They actually sold off their contractor billable hours part of the business and restructured everything around this, online, what we called misattribution
Mhm.
technologies. And so I was effectively a chief scientist for them. I'm spending all my time, doing architecture on things because they were all spooks. Also, they didn't want to talk to anyone. So I was also basically the face and spokesman for the company. So I was doing all of our
Mm.
videos and going to conferences and things like that, and still working with customers. And that was a lot of fun. So I didn't feel an urge to quit. But after a couple of years, I went to the CEO and said, I'm not meeting with customers that much anymore. I don't need to live in DC anymore. I don't want to live in DC anymore. I want to go buy a vineyard in wine country and go live there instead. And I can quit or I can telecommute. And they were perfectly happy with me telecommuting. The CEO flew me out himself on his jet and spent the weekend with us. And, uh, you know, it's really hard to quit that, actually, right? They just made it so comfortable, so nice, and so interesting
Uh-huh.
that I stayed on until the beginning of 2020 when I was just like, I really, really need to go do something else. I'm feeling that huge itch to start exploring new directions.
Okay, so at that point, you're in the Bay Area. You have a vineyard, and like, tell us more. Like, what was the reason you had to leave? Was it just because you had something in mind that you wanted to start, or just something in your life, new chapter?
Yeah, I mean, it was really that. So we'd been out here for a while, and my long term goal was to end up in wine country. I'd been working towards this since well before I moved to DC. I knew that was kind of the lifestyle outcome that I wanted.
Yep.
But there was a burnout. I'd been doing the same kind of technology, producing the same kind of content, working on the same sort of strategies for long enough that I was beginning to feel some burnout. And I really feel you should always get out before you burn out, right? Don't wait for someone to decide that you're not adding value and fire you.
Uh-huh.
Leave when they're still happy that you're there. And in fact, I'm still a strategic advisor to the company, so they were apparently pretty happy with that. But yeah, I mean, I really had started doing more and more angel investing and startup advising. So I joined the North Bay Angels as soon as I moved here, started doing angel investments, and that led me to some local mentoring groups. And from there, that kind of spiraled into a bigger and bigger part of what I was doing. And I just discovered a huge passion for that. I love working with early stage founders, helping them, really craft that unmolded clay of their business ideas into something that's going to be functional and make money and be fundable. And so that ran for a while in 2019. Even before I quit, I launched a YouTube channel for startup advice because one-on-one coaching doesn't scale very well. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've just kind of continued to push that out. I'm now president of the North Bay Angels and, uh, you know, putting together training programs for founders and under Founder Quest. It's a new thing I've launched.
Now, remind or refresh my memory here. So when you're working with founders, is your like main thing about I know you work with them holistically, but is your main differentiator focused on the funding side of it? Is that what I
Yeah.
remember?
Yeah. So funding is, I've really discovered that funding is when founders hit a brick wall that they can't sort of get around on their own, right? All the
Uh-huh.
other challenges, usually they're able to, ask ChatGPT or watch a video or, just spend some
Mm.
night time, late night coding or something like that. They can scrappy their way around the problem. But, with the fundraising, they suddenly realize that they've talked to 30 or 40 angels and early stage VCs, and they're just getting no, 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 no across the board,
Mm-hmm.
and they know that they're missing something and they read the things and it's still not working. They don't quite get it. And so that is the spot where they're now willing to engage with someone on the outside. And so I did a lot
Mm-hmm.
of this with some accelerators, but they often take equity. And I know a lot of founders are really resistant to those kind of equity based deals, especially you're giving away several percent of the company for some unknown benefit. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a big question mark for them. So
Mm-hmm.
I do a few for like that, but actually mostly we do it on a paid basis these days.
But are you positioning, like, is your niche founding? I'm sorry, is your niche fundraising for founders or just overall founder coaching?
So the program event involves general founder coaching, but the on ramp into it and the formalities of the program are mostly around fundraising. And I don't do it for them, but it
Uh-huh.
is a matter of really teaching them the methodology that I've developed over the last decade of working with founders, starting with the angels and then, with all the other platforms. And really, it all comes out of my scientific background. I really take a very experiment first, testing and validating approach to all aspects of fundraising and really pre-fundraising. A lot of the program that I do is actually about how do you talk to customers, how do you validate customer demand, how do you test your ability to market to them and reach and
Mm.
messaging and all of these things, which of course the investors want to see because they know it's important, but often, especially technical founders, haven't focused on, but they desperately need for themselves, right? They
Yeah.
should be doing all of these things and making sure they're doing the right thing before they spend a huge amount of time building the product. Now, I rarely get them that early. Usually they've already built their
Hmm.
beautiful system and they're a solution in search of a problem.
Yeah. No, I really just, you know, because you have a really successful advisory. And so it's interesting just to understand, like, that's your you're because there's a lot of folks helping founders and a lot of folks helping CEOs, and so it's everybody has their niche, and you found a really good one there, and you kind of explained why, because a lot of these other problems can be solved maybe even without an advisor, right? And then this one needs that expert's help. Okay, let's talk about angel investing. So you're the president of North Bay Angels. I think you've invested in quite a few companies. What are some insight? Let's talk about insights, maybe commonalities you see in the most successful angels, or anything else you want to share about that.
So, as with a lot of things, success often comes down to hard work.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've seen a lot of data, and this certainly comes out in my own experience, that the success rate of angels is proportional to the amount of due diligence that they do. And so they
Mm.
really need to do quite a lot or be piggybacking off people who do a lot of due diligence. And so being involved in angel groups is a huge value because there'll be someone in the group who knows the space that you're investing in. They can be the experts and you can benefit from what they provide. My discipline when I started was I made a commitment to make zero investments in my first year.
Okay, learn first.
Learn first and level set, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I could tell from the very first pitches I saw that you're going to get excited. This person's a good presenter. They speak well. They're excited. They make what they're doing sound really interesting. And the temptation is to jump in and jump in big on the first one you see because, oh my God, that was amazing. Whereas after a couple of years, you suddenly realize, well, no, he's a pretty good public speaker, but this was a stupid idea, or it's a mediocre execution, or he hasn't really
Yeah.
validated the details on this, or I've seen 8 other companies with exactly the same idea in the last 6 months. Right? I mean, there's this huge tendency towards herd-like behavior where everyone's running towards the same thing. And over this last year, I can't tell you how many AI-based you know applications of something. It's a marketplace with AI or a recruiting with AI or this with and there are many in every single one of those niches because it's an obvious thing to do, right? It's not a particularly
Mm.
insightful approach to say, hey, you could use AI with this. Like, yes, it's obvious you could use AI with that. And so I'm always looking for companies that have a real unique insight. And often I really like ones in unsexy areas, places where not everyone is running in the same direction, but there is a huge market. There's a big opportunity. There's a big need, but it's not the current hotness. And so they have much less competition and much more ability to sort of build out their solution and achieve the success.
Do you have a thought on the following? Okay, so I remember, I listened to the All In podcast, and I don't know if you know those guys, but they're a bunch of venture guys, right? Yeah. So the venture meaning a step after you, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Angel, venture, PE. I mean, it's kind of like up the food chain, maybe, or a little different path. Venture's a different path than PE, but I remember it was pretty interesting. Chamath was talking about returns they had to get. Okay, S&P averages, say, I don't know, 10 or 12%, but it's liquid. Venture needs to make you 20% because it's illiquid, or even more than 20, but something like that, right? I think people would be happy if they every year got 20%. Is angel in York's, because I've heard stories both ways where angel's almost like a charity sometimes. Maybe those folks aren't doing a great job. Do you have a way to say it's better than 20, less than 20, or just totally unable? Like it's everybody's experience is different.
So there are definitely two flavors of angel investors, I think. There's the
Uh-huh.
ones who are serious and systematic about it and are looking at this as an investment vehicle. And so they're committing to a portfolio based model. They're going to make at least 20 investments of similar size. They're going to set aside dry powder for follow on investments. They're going to try to have a diversity in things because, yeah, if you only make 3 or 4 investments, the odds of any of them being successful at a level that will return meaningful returns over the 10 years it takes for a decent exit are minuscule. And so, yeah, absolutely. You've got the people who've got a lot of money, have been successful. Yeah, I'll write you a $25,000 or $50,000 check. It's not that big a deal to me. I am excited to be part of this. I can talk about it at cocktail parties. And if I make money from that, awesome, right? That's upside. Or there's the ones who are more systematic about this. And so I've made roughly 30 investments so far. And, a lot of them have failed. I've got a couple that are looking really good. None of the good ones have popped yet. It's been over, the last decade or so that I've been deploying into these spaces. And that's the kind of time scale you're looking at. So,
Mm-hmm.
angels, because they're investing so much earlier, we can see a 20 to 50x return, which is what you need in uh, with a lower exit because we came in with a much lower valuation, right? We're putting in at a $2 to $5 million valuation, whereas the venture capital guys are putting in at, uh, you know, $20 million valuation or something like that. So their
Mm-hmm.
endpoint needs to be 10x my endpoint to have the same percentage returns.
Yeah, that now what are the typical angel checks? I know they can vary, but is it common where they're just 25,000 or are they usually bigger?
I would say the average is 25,000.
Oh,
That's the
got it.
most
Okay.
common number that we see,
Uh-huh.
and there are some people who'll be putting in 50 or 100, but that's much less common.
Oh,
And they've got to be very high net worth because remember you're going to make 20 or 30 investments. If you're making 20 or 30 $100,000 investments, you're deploying it. That's a lot of capital,
yes,
and so
yes.
the number of people who are in a position to do that is much smaller.
Yeah. Wow. And then how about after you've made your 30 investments? I know part of it's fun probably at the beginning because you're like, well, I get to hear my updates now on these companies. But then after a while, now you got a lot of updates. So is there sort of like you can choose to not be so involved in these companies? You're just the investor here, because that's 30 different updates every month or every quarter, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've never turned any of them off
Uh-huh.
actually, but by the time they're getting on to, say, their A round or B round, they usually have a lot more support around them, right? They've got other investors, people who are more connected into the infrastructure than I am. And so their need for help from someone like me is definitely diminishing. So I enjoy, as I have time, taking a look at what they're doing, but I'm no longer really actively engaged with the company once they're getting farther down the path. But
Hmm.
you've got to have some intestinal fortitude because there's something called the J curve in investing. Because the reality is that companies tend to fail fast and succeed slow. So when if you were to do all 30 investments on the same day, which of course you're not, you would see that you'd be losing a lot of money early on as the ones that, for whatever reason, didn't get traction over the first couple of years start failing and failing and failing and failing. And of course, you've seen zero returns typically during that period. So you've now locked in a bunch of losses and you don't actually see things go positive until maybe you've got a couple of modest exits in year, say 5, 6. And then by the time you're getting to 10, maybe you've got some big pops from the guys who are actually successful, or maybe even 15. Some of these companies that are really successful, the ones you want to be in, they're staying private for a long time. And so it could be, a shockingly long time before you see liquidity.
Yeah, I second everything you said. After I sold, I did do a lot of I didn't do it as strategically as you did, but I did some private investing, but a lot of these were friends, and so I had good knowledge of the companies, right? And gosh, we always just think things should go a lot faster, right? I'm a couple years into it, and I completely resonate. But now I can see some of them turning around. One of them I wasn't I was pretty negative on, and now that's turning around. Another one not so good, and a couple of others have some time to go. But yeah, it's definitely it's a fun thing, and it is nice getting in early and actually having a reasonable percentage of a company versus a bunch of zeros after before that number. So
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, being able to have a piece of that early stage when they're still creating things. But I think
mhm.
it also really, your experience shows that it makes you humble about your ability to spot the winners.
Oh
You
yeah,
may have
it's
huge
hard.
confidence in some company, and yeah, there's just so many pivots. There's so many random chances. There's so many, competitor comes in, incumbent takes over, uh, underlying market landscape shifts. Who knows? And then there's pivots like mine.
Yeah.
You may end up doing something radically different than where you started, which is why I think that conventional wisdom of back the team, not the product, is a mantra that you hear over and over again. Not that the product isn't important, but it's really more about how did you develop the product and how are you testing it than the details of the product, which will almost certainly change.
100%. Yeah, I like two of the operators have already done it before, and already had exits before. So that, like I don't know a lot in this world. I just saw that and I'm like, okay, they've already done it. That means a lot to me, and that ups the odds for sure.
You know what's
So
funny is even a failed startup radically improves the odds of success.
yeah, great point. They've learned a lot on that failure.
Exactly, right.
Mhm.
They know what didn't work. They're not starting from scratch. They understand a lot of the
Mm,
way these games are played. And it just gives them such a huge leg up on that first time person who's, in my videos, I always describe it as climbing the vertical learning curve. Because as a founder, suddenly it's like you need to learn everything about everything all at
yep.
once. And
Yep.
it's insane.
Mm, that is so true. Okay, well, Lance, I could talk to you and we could go into, astrophysics, which I know very little about, but I'm interested in. But we'll have to do that on another one. So let's wrap it up with two questions. Last one, I'll ask you kind of to share what you're doing on the coaching side. But before we get there, what is the best advice you've ever received? Or if that doesn't come to mind, a principle that you live by as a founder?
I think the best advice I received was to really take time to work on the business, not in the business. Right? It's so easy to be in the trenches, head down, executing, 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 and it feels wasteful to do that prairie dogging and look up, look around, think strategically, try to look at that bigger picture, keep a finger on the pulse of what's going on in the wider world. But that's often where the opportunities come from, right? Like that Voice of
Hmm.
America story. He had to be prairie dogging to see that opportunity.
Yeah, and that's so true. It's work on the business, but then the second part, getting the opportunities. Because a lot of times, if we just stay focused, that's fine. We can build out our business, but your company changed two or three times along the way. It would have, if you'd never made those pivots, it would have been a totally different company, probably a lot smaller and a lot less interesting. And so you had to be there for those changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Well, tell us about, because you're doing actually a lot on the coaching side, because you do some one-on-one, you've got a YouTube channel, and then you're also doing like a group coaching setup, right?
Exactly, right. So, yeah, I've got consulting hours, so you can get on my calendar, reach out to me through LinkedIn, or go to my platform, Feel the Boot.
Hmm.
And Feel the Boot actually came about because some of the people I was advising, I was actually on their board, started spontaneously just referring to me as the Boot, and I decided to lean into it. So Feel the Boot is my YouTube channel. It's got like currently 117, 118 episodes and essays of information for startup founders, totally free, lots of good content there. That's a great place to get a sense of, among other things, whether I resonate with you and the things I'm saying make sense. Uh, then I also just recently launched a program focused around helping founders with the fundraising process, because we discussed that is when they hit the wall. That's
Hmm.
called Founder Quest, and there we're running workshops every other week. And then the members of the Founder Quest program also then get office hours every week. Been running that now for just about a month, and that's super exciting. The interactions that we're getting, the way the founders are helping each other, the active questioning, and everything about it is really working way better than I expected. So I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. Well, thanks for everything. We're going to have those links in the show notes. And guys, go check it out, Lance. Especially if you're, just getting going, raising. Not only will Lance be able to help you strategically on the raising side, but he's seen so many companies. Because he's president of North Bay Angels. I think that gives you, Lance, like that extra advantage of an advisor, because you just see so many deals. I'm sure there's things you tell these guys, you probably don't even think it's valuable, but it's gold because of all the deals you've seen.
Yeah, it is funny, right? Once you've seen multiple thousands of pitch decks and actually
Yeah.
talked to a couple thousand founders, yeah, you
Mhm.
really start to feel the rhymes and what's going on.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. Really appreciate your time today and have a wonderful day.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.